So it's 4 a.m. and I am staring at this ancient wooden ceiling. I'm in Maastricht to talk to a writing client, so I really need to get some sleep because I need to be on my game tomorrow. But I can't sleep because I'm thinking about this book that I'm reading. And the book is about epigenetics, the idea that what your ancestors experience passes down in your DNA, that you don't just get like hair color and eye color from them, that literally their experiences pass through your genes. And I can't stop thinking about this. Eventually, I just give up and I spend the rest of the morning reading this book. And when I see my coworkers and I tell them about what I've been reading, immediately they latch on to the idea of ancestral trauma. Like one of my coworkers is from this country that has seen centuries of religious warfare. And she immediately starts meditating on what her ancestors would have experienced and wondering how that might play out in her personality. One of my other coworkers is going through a really bad divorce. And she starts meditating on like what must have happened in the past to have me choose this person. And I get that, right? Like it's really natural for us to think about trauma. But I'm wondering about it in something entirely different. What about our ancestors' joys? Is that something we can get in our genes? Like, did I have, as a white American, it means I have immigrants across my family tree. You just have to go far enough up the branches and you'll get an immigrant. Did one of those immigrants have their life completely transformed by moving? And that's why I fell so batshit crazy in love with Amsterdam when I moved here. Did that get reflected in my life? And what about like the more intangible stuff? Like, what about my tendency to zig when everyone else is zagging? Could that be possibly ancestral? And I start thinking about this. I can't let go of it. This idea that like this thing that where I always seem to be slightly out of step. So I start wondering if I'm descended from a Beguine. And if you don't know the Begijnes, so it's that beautiful courtyard near Kalverstraat, that kind of like hidden courtyard. And basically, where the Begijnes came from is in the Middle Ages, if you were born a woman, you had two choices. You could marry as your family chose for you, and that man would have literal power of life and death. He controlled all the money. He decided where you lived. He decided what you did. And it was incredibly rare for a man to be punished for killing his wife, much less beating her. If a man beat his wife, it was probably her fault. You can become a nun, but to be honest, that's not quite so different as you might think. You're still making a lifelong vow to ... You don't have any money. They control your money. They control what you do. They control where you are. No worries. And that means like, if you're someone like me, if you found an abbess who would support you writing history, that abbess wouldn't be in charge of you your entire life. At some point, that abbess would die or get moved away. And then someone else could come in that says, oh, I don't think women should read. And you don't really have a choice. There's nothing you can really do about it. And the Begijnes were a third option in this very structured society where everyone had a place and everyone had something they had to do. So what the Begijnes were is they were a lay order. So you had to promise to follow the rules while you were there, but you could leave whenever you wanted. People would be a Begijn for a while and then leave to get married. You kept your own money. This was one of the few ways as a woman where you could have some sort of control of your own money. Like it changed a little bit throughout the centuries, but basically wealthy Begijns owned their houses, poorer Begijns lived in them and kind of like did a little extra work to support the community. And then it again happened in various different ways, but basically there was a pot of money that people were able to live off of. And so here in the center of Amsterdam, there was this way in a society where where women had these very strict rules. There was a way that you could be a midwife, that you could be a writer, you could study history. And this little community existed. And in fact, it kept existing when the entire city went Protestant. The Begijns were the only place that stayed Catholic because the Begijns owned the houses. The city took the church and they were going to give it to the Protestants. And the Begijns, I swear to God, this is true, basically held the city off for almost 3 decades by locking the door. The Begijnhof was surrounded by water and there was one gate in. And they had the right to, they'd gotten from the city the right to lock the door because, oh, we're all women here. We need to be able to protect ourselves. So they just kept the door locked. It literally took almost 30 years before the city was like, no, seriously, you have to unlock it during the day so that the Protestants can use the church. So then this English Protestant church is set up in the middle of this Catholic community. And they set up their hidden church, their Schuilkerk, the house church, directly opposite the church that had been taken from them. And at first they were subtle about it, and then they got less subtle. And the thing is, there was this woman who had kind of seen a lot of this change, right? And she'd actually become, she'd been there so long that she became the leader. And when she was dying, she looked at the other Begijns and she said, I don't want to be buried with the heretics. See, this is a time period where you were usually buried under the floor of the church. There was a couple graveyards. There was a free Black community in the Jewish area, and they had a graveyard that was slightly outside of the city. But in general, you were buried underneath your local church. And Cornelia did not want to be buried under the church that had been taken from them. And there's a bunch of different reasons why. One story says that her family had gone Protestant and she was so ashamed of her family going Protestant that she didn't want anything to do with them in the afterlife. I personally wonder, you have to imagine this is a community of women and there's these guys trooping in every frickin' day. I think it was an accumulation. I don't think there was one incident where she fought with this guy and she's like, that's it, I'm done with the heretics. I think it was every single day watching these men who didn't believe what she did, who she didn't want there, watching them tromp in to her church. I think that was it. I think she said, I can't spend the rest of my eternity with them. So she made the Begijns promise that they wouldn't bury her under the church. And the Begijns were overruled. Cornelia was buried underneath the floor of what is now called the English church. And then night fell and the door was locked. And then in the morning, the door was unlocked and the English church fathers come trooping in and Cornelia's coffin is right there on the path outside of the church. And the women are like, it's a miracle. I see you know where this is going. And so the church fathers are really upset and they bury the coffin back under the church floor. And they say a few extra prayers to make sure she stays there. But then night falls and they go out that gate into the rest of Amsterdam. The doors are locked behind them. And then the next morning when they come back, the coffin is right there on the path again. Now, I love imagining this conversation. I love because remember, the whole thing with the Protestants is we do not believe in miracles and saints anymore. So I love them confronting the Begijns, saying, clearly you're doing this, stop doing this. And the Begijns saying, listen, you've heard of the miracle of Amsterdam. This is exactly what happened in the miracle of Amsterdam. The unblemished host kept disappearing when the people tried to remove it from where it was from. It kept reappearing at where it was found. Clearly, miracle. And I can just imagine this conversation going round and round and round. And then it got night. Locked the doors. Came back in the morning. Cornelia's right back there. And they're like, you know what? Fine. We'll bury her under the path. And so she got her wish. Whether it was a miracle or, as I would prefer to believe, the creative disobedience of the Begijns. And that's why I love this story, because that's what I love about Amsterdam. That if you look at Amsterdam's history, there are so many examples of this defiant spirit of, I'm not going to do what you tell me to do, and more importantly than that, I'm going to disobey you in a creative way that you haven't thought of, so it takes you completely off guard. And the other thing I love about this story is that it should have disappeared. I shouldn't be able to tell you about this. But there was a rector in the English church 100 years later who talked to some of the older Begijns, and those older Begijns had a story that they'd heard from some of the older Begijns when they were young. And the rector went to investigate it, and he actually found Cornelia's coffin. If you go into the Begijnhof on May 2nd, you'll see this outline in the path covered in forget-me-nots. To this day, this act of defiance, the last Begijn died in 1971, but to this day, this act of defiance is remembered. And that's why I love Amsterdam. And that's why we should be telling more stories about Amsterdam. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.